Thank you. Yeah, so last time, I'm not going to repeat the things we said about cycles, but some of the concepts we used last time, I'm going to reintroduce them, especially for those who weren't there. But even for those who were there, some ideas, it's good to hear them more than once, because it's not always easy to absorb what they mean. But I thought I would start with 3 stories about transitions, more like narratives about how it happened concretely in certain historical periods. And so maybe I should say something. So what I'm offering in a way is a perspective, right? It's looking at the history of civilization from the point of view of the commons. It's not the only point of view, of course. When I was young, it was almost like the point of view of the state. So we were learning in history about the kings and the battle. So that was really like state formation at the center of our vision, and like nation-state formation in a way. For example, I'm Flemish, right, from the northern part of Belgium. I've never learned in school that we were part of the Holy Roman Empire for 3 centuries, which is Germany, right? Never heard that. I don't know why, but it's because the perspective was only that was interesting, which eventually led to the construction of Belgium. And so that was like a bit annoying to talk about that we're part of Germany, I guess. And so we just never heard about it. So that's the problem with the perspective, right, is that you have an object, like a historical object, you illuminate it, but there's always a shadow, right? And of course there'll be a shadow in what I'm saying. But the idea, of course, is that if you have more than one perspective, then you can diminish the shadow, right? And so maybe it's interesting to have like a libertarian history. They always focus on the market, which is not mine, but I was reading yesterday, trade creates wealth. And I said, what do you mean trade? Like, who's making the stuff you're trading, right? So I don't agree with that. That's a perspective, right? But it's actually also interesting to suspend your disbelief and say, okay, let's assume that trade creates wealth, and then see what comes out of that. So that's what I invite you to do. And I think through these stories that I'm telling you in the beginning, I want to show you that, you can actually look at history through the eyes of the commons, and something, different comes out of it, right? You see different possibilities. And so as usual, I have to apologize. I'm from Europe. It's what I know best. But this time I have an example from Japan, 16th century Japan. But so here's what I would love. If anybody likes what I'm doing, and you know more about China or India, please join us and bring us these other examples. That would be really great, to have a common perspective that is from other parts of the world. I don't have it, because to be honest, there's only so much time in our life, right? And so when I was in my 20s and 30s, I wanted to understand everything, and I was doing, Hinduism and Taoism and Confucianism, and I was trying it out and reading the history. But now I'm in a stage where there's so much to learn about European history that I never learned. I said, that's what I want to do now. So, there's only so much time, right? So we would all like to be world-centric, but it's difficult to do on your own. All right, so here's a story I never heard myself. It's from a book called The First European Revolution. And it's really a fantastic book about really the first social revolution in Europe that nobody, I don't think you have heard about. Okay, so what happened? So 5th century, the end of Roman Empire. But it's not like nothing exists after that, right? Rome falls, but actually the Roman system persists. It's just that it's splintered, but you go to Gaul or Spain, you'll find that the structures of the Roman Empire are still there. There's still legionnaires, they still have their Roman hats, they still have senators, and it's just that the whole system has collapsed, but they still exist. And it's really only in the 8th century when the Islam, with Muslims, basically take control of the whole of the Mediterranean, that Europe loses every connection with trade. There's no more cities, there's no more roads. The Franks, who control the northern part of Europe, they don't know how to deal with boats. And so the Vikings comes from the north, the Muslims come from, they're 70 miles from Paris. You have to imagine, what that means. And then the Avars come from the east. And so, this is a region of the world that is invaded every 20 years by different barbarian tribes. They rape and pillage. So in the 9th century, you have Charlemagne. He's the first to try to regroup. And it doesn't work. So by the 10th century, again, Europe is in like a total mess. And bizarrely, by that time you had the strongest institutions were the monastics. So the Benedictine monasteries, had become huge, like thousands of people doing farming, crafts, and this is maybe not so known, but the surplus of trade was created by the monks. Rich people, they need luxury goods, but the actually overflow of food and beer, because they were making beer, and cheese, because they were making cheese. All that stuff came from the monks. They were the organized, productive communities of the time. But they, the warrior class was very undisciplined. So, they would rape and pillage and steal the gold from the churches. And so in 975, you have to think in that time, right? Everybody is believing in the Christian religion. So basically what you have to imagine is the monks in front with the Holy Virgin, if you're Catholic, followed by the people, and they would really confront the feudals with their sins. Imagine that. So within the space of 50 years, this created a wholly different Europe. So 3 things happened. So this is like an agreement. It's called the Peace of God movement, charters, Peace of God charters, in 600 different cities. So this is huge. You have to imagine, medieval Europe, very small cities like Paris is 10,000. But there's again, quite a few small cities around. And so here's the first rule. I know it sounds strange. Make love, not war. What does that mean? Well, if you're noble and you want to expand your land, you'd fight, right? Well, now you promise you won't fight, but you'll marry your sons and daughters to each other, right? So that pacifies the feudal system, creates interfeudal peace, if you like. The second accord, piece of this accord, is primogeniture. I don't know if you know what that is, but it basically means the oldest son gets everything. Now, if you look at history, why did the Mongols invade the whole of Asia and Europe? So it's related to this. And this is, if you're egalitarian, this is not good news. But if you have a system in which you divide the land equally between all your children, you end up with very, very, very small amounts of land, right? So that's what happened in Rwanda, 20 years ago, is too little land to survive. People get very angry and desperate, and then bad things happen. People start hating other people. And so once you do primogeniture, as bad as it sounds for an egalitarian point of view, what you actually do is you create peace inside the family, right? So now you know that the land won't be divided. You know that the oldest son will get everything. So you don't have to fight within the family. It's you get it. Don't have to worry about it. You'll get that land, and the land will be undivided, right? But now you have a problem. Now you have all these young men, because they still make a lot of children at that time, right? 5, 6, 7, 8, who knows? And all these young men, with a lot of energy, and these are not peaceful times, right? So what do you do with them? Well, the thing you do is you go on a conquest, right? So there's 2 choices. Either you send them to the monkhood, which is of course what a lot of people did, but that means you have to have a monkhood, which we had in Europe. I don't think the Mongols had it. Maybe later on, but certainly not in the beginning. And the other thing is you make them into warriors, and if you want land, you have to get it, right? You have to conquer something and then say it's yours, right? And think about it. So Europe went from a situation where it was invaded by these 3 forces, and now it's in the Middle East, right? 50 years after these reforms, now the Europeans are conquering the Middle East, right? Just to show you how how strong that shift was, right? This was like a total reversal of the situation. So what does the commons have to do with this? At first it sounds negative, but so the third rule in these social charters was actually to forbid the commoners to chase, to hunt, right? So suddenly you cannot hunt, so suddenly you cannot have meat. I know if you're vegetarian that's not a problem, at least at that time people saw that as a problem. And so basically that created an enormous pressure on the peasantry to become more productive, right? And so paradoxically that created a productivity revolution in Europe, because now we have to work harder to feed ourselves. But it was, so those three rules were extraordinarily successful because it doubled the population in Europe and it tripled the population in Western Europe in like a very short time. I'm not sure how long it took, but like a very, very, very short time. And so the thing is that it created a wave of commoning. So basically, and you can read about this, the Silent Revolution, Tino de Moor. It's an essay, you can read it, it's like 20 pages, it's really good. And it shows in these 70 years after 1975, you have an explosion of farmer commons, like basically agreements amongst farmers, and guilds, agreements among workers, right? So Europe completely changes, and in a way, the commons become much more stable in that period, right? And so what I'm trying to convince you of is that this was a good thing. This created the conditions for 3 centuries of very, very, very high growth. And so that's like what we call the High Middle Ages, where everything came back. The cities came back. And they grew very fast. So by the 14th century, we have all these Italian city-states, and we have Ghent and Bruges, and the Hanseatic League. That's basically all the result of this social contract that I'm just trying to explain, right? And so that's interesting that you can. So because if you don't know that, you think, well, it's always about states and markets, right? But the conditions to actually have healthy states and markets are often based on the fact that there are commons. So they're the stable element, right? So think about it as a social security system. If you're a farmer, and there's droughts and there's hunger cycles, if you have a commons, you always have something you can go back to, right? This is from us. This is what we can grow collectively as a farmer community. And it's so important in the Middle Ages that, so there is this ritual, it's called the Rogentide procession. This was after Christmas and Easter, the most important Christian ritual. And so basically what would happen is that the parishioners, right, they would go around the parish, the village, and they would reconfirm their commons. They would say, this is our commons. Why would they do that? Well, because maybe the nearby village would expand and say, no, it's our commons. But also the Lord might not respect the local commons. Right? So there's a need to reaffirm this is, and so also central to their identity, like this is who we are, this is from us as a local village community. And the same thing you have to imagine in the city, the guilds, this is a very strong identity as well, right? I'm a crafts worker, I make good bread, I'm controlled by my peers to make good bread, right? There's rules, collective rules, but they're also religious fraternities, right? They're brothers and sisters, right? And it's a social security system as well. So even the pirates, I know that's not a good example, but pirates were guilds. So basically you make an agreement, like a short-term guild, and 25% goes to the captain, he's the entrepreneur, right? He puts forward the money, because the ship is really expensive. 25% for the officers, 25% for everybody else, and 25% for the orphans and the widows. So that's how a guild works. It takes care of its own people, but they also had their own judicial system. So in Europe, we have actually a system in these free cities where you had self-managed guild commons that run the city. And only later on, the merchants have more influence and take over, right? But certainly in the beginning, like 11th, 12th, 13th century, you have to imagine these cities as being run by the working class, right? By the way, in China, you have something similar, but I don't know much about it. You know Mozi? Yeah, Mose, sorry. He's a guy like that, right? He's like a socialist or whatever you want to call it. He's a commoner. And he goes around the cities in China and teaches them how to defend themselves against the kings and the emperors, right? So he's a kind of a similar idea, but I don't know much about it, but I would love to learn more about it. But so I'm partial to Mose because of that, because he's like, in favor of the local people and their autonomy and their self-management. And the Pythagoreans in Greece, again, I don't know that much about, but they were also like that. They were engineers, right? They're engineering guilds, and they go from Greek polis to polis to help these polises defend themselves against the Persians and the Macedonians. And so I'm just saying, this is not just in Europe. This is something, a dynamic. I don't know much about it in other places, but it's worth looking at. And it gives you a different vision of history that, where the commons, you can see the commons as a factor, right? So now let me show you how that ended, because that's equally interesting. So we're now in the 14th century. A lot of people would say, this is the official history, that the plague came back to Europe. And because of the plague, Europe got disorganized. There's a book by Barbara Tuchman. What's the name of that book? It's like The Horrible Century or something like that, right? So you have to see 14th century Europe. Excuse me?
Distant mirror, I think.
Yeah, that could be it. Yeah, that's one I read 30 years ago, and to be honest, I forgot most of it. But it's like a description of like everything went wrong at the same time. And so the plague is like the thing that is blamed for that. But so I want to give you an example. Think about an earthquake, right? So there was an earthquake in New Zealand, maybe 10, 15 years ago. I went there 3 years later. Couldn't see anything. Like, it was as if the earthquake didn't happen. Now go to Haiti, and there was a similar earthquake. And 20 years later, it's like the earthquake was yesterday. So what's the difference? So it's not the earthquake. It's the integrative capacity of that society to deal with a catastrophe. So here's how I'm going to make an argument that actually what happened that created a society in Europe that was no longer able to withstand the effects of the plague. And so what I would argue is the destruction of the commons, in a way, right? So here's where you can find it in a book called The Mystery of Money, which I really recommend. It's from a Belgian reformer, Bernard Lietard. By the way, if you're Chinese, you will see he talks about yin-yang money, very interesting. And he says, it's the destruction of the yin-yang money that is at stake. And I'll explain to you what that means. So the origin of money, you have to imagine a temple in Mesopotamia. And, basically, okay, if we want to stay here and survive, we need to master nature, right? So we need irrigation, we need to organize irrigation, we need to have a large-scale society where we can mobilize labor to manage irrigation. And so the temple priests are basically the first class that is in charge of this, right? So what is money? Money is like a ledger, right? So it's basically saying, you're a farmer, you gave me so much rice, but rice doesn't stay good, right? It goes down. It rots. So I'm gonna take off that ledger every year 5 or 10% of the value represented by your rice, because your rice doesn't stay good, right? So in other words, thousands of years, money had a negative interest rate, and it's not just only that. If you look at Mesopotamia, China, India, they had jubilees and clean slate legislation. I don't know if you know what that is, but basically every 25 years, all the debts were wiped out. So why would you do that? Well, basically because if you don't do that, you enslave your own population, right? Because then the rich, lend to the poor can't pay back their debts, and then you end up as a slave. Your own people are the slaves, right? And that's probably not a healthy situation, right? So of course the alternative is you don't make slaves inside and you conquer. I'm not saying that's better, but that's the solution that was chosen. Is you conquer instead, and then you ask for tribute and stuff. Anyway, so what happened in the 14th century is we had a religious revolution in the south of France, the north of Italy, called the Cathars. And so they were Gnostic dualists. I don't know if you know a bit about it, but it's very simple. So if you're a Catholic, evil doesn't really exist. God is goodness, beauty, the true, the beautiful, and it's like Plotinus and Plato. So he emanates that goodness in the world, but some beings are not able to take it, and so evil is a lack of good. Right? It's a pretty optimistic vision of the world in the end, right? But the Gnostics, starting in Zoroaster and then the Manichaeans, they actually see that differently. There's good and evil in the world. There are two spiritual principles at equal strength. And so that idea became Christianized, and that's the Cathars. Or the Bogomiles, and they have different names. But anyway, they became almost hegemonic in these regions. Like even the feudal class were converting to this religion. Now, you might think this is maybe not a big issue, but it's, because I would have spontaneous sympathy for the Cathars. It's a minority and they get repressed and killed by the evil Catholic Church. But you have to think of it, can a civilization have those two completely different, philosophies in one place? Maybe it can, but maybe it can't, right? So that's why you see this kind of civil wars, because sometimes people feel that no, I cannot live in the same civilization with people who think completely differently about the nature of the world. So it's a serious thing, right? So anyway, so the First Crusade was organized by the Catholic Church with the French king and nobility of the north against the south of France. And they literally exterminated them, which is not a good thing, right? But the second thing they did is they changed the nature of money. And so money became positive interest rate. Royal money has a positive interest. So what's the difference? So if you live before that time, you get coins, right? You get 5 coins, and every 4 years you have to give back 5 coins, and you get 4 coins back. What does that mean? That means you cannot accumulate money, because if you accumulate money, you impoverish yourself. So you have to invest that money, right? And so that's why if you look at between the 11th and the 14th century, we had such a high growth rate because everybody was investing everything they had. So the mills, right? Everyone was just investing, because if I don't invest, even if you're rich, hoarding doesn't make sense, right? And so this is appropriate in a situation where you think, and maybe correctly at the time, that you cannot grow, right? Because if you have interest-based money in a static system that can only grow to conquest, that's not good. You don't want the people inside your country to impoverish your own citizen. But once you have that, once you have positive interest rates, now you have to grow. Right? Because I lend from you 100 and I have to give you back 200. And there is a theory which I actually believe in. You can find it in Michael Hudson, The Decline of Civilization, that this process of usury is actually also what destroys every civilization. Brutus, the guy who killed Caesar, he was a lender. He asked 40% interest per year, right? Anyway, so this is one of the theories, and I think it's a really interesting thing about it this way, that explains what went wrong in Europe. And then capitalism came. And so here I want to introduce another notion which I think is very important, which is contributory labor. So it's how we think about work, right? So if you have a class-based empire, like the Greeks and the Romans, basically work is for slaves. So work is not a positive value in your society. It's like an obligation from nature that you want to be liberated from. And if you're a citizen, a Roman citizen, you have slaves, and they work for you, and you can do philosophy. So the ideal of a Greek citizen is basically to be thinking about the meaning of life and not to be attached. You know, Epicureanism, Stoicism, all of these philosophies, but they profoundly disdain work, right? And by the end of the Roman Empire is this complete divorce where you say, the soul, the body is a tomb for the soul, right? That's a very negative view of the body. And I may sound a bit pro-Christian here, but I'll just tell you why this is important. Because the Christians, what they did was reverse that idea, right? Suddenly, ora et labora. You have to work and pray. So work, and so this you can explain a little bit by the nature of those religions. So Eastern religions, and of course I know I'm simplifying, but is, okay, let me first say how it happens. Like, if you read the Bible, right? There's chaos and God creates order in the chaos. So chaos is bad and order is good. So if you're a Christian, a Jew, or a Muslim, your duty is to make the world a better place, to be in harmony with the original plans, right? But that's really not how Buddhists think about it. And maybe you correct me, but even Hindus, which is, we live in a world of illusion, samsara, right? And we have to turn away from the world of illusion to a world of non-order, nirvana. So you can see the difference in fundamental choice about the nature of the world, right? And so if you're a Buddhist monk, you have a communism of consumption, right? You beg, you get money from working people, so you don't have to work, and you can dedicate yourself to the real world, the inner world that shows you things, right? But if you're a Christian monk, you have a communism of production. Like, we're all working together, farming, crafts, praying, intellectuality in one integrated community that is working to do something beautiful in the world. Now, of course, in practice, you go to a Zen monastery, it's very beautiful as well, right? So, I'm not saying it's like that. But, so why is this important? Because here we have a vision where work is a positive thing. It's how human beings bring more order and complexity in the world, right? And in a way, this is what is destroyed by the capitalist order, right? So when the feudal system collapsed in the 14th century, in the beginning it's very good for labor, right? Because if everybody dies, 1/3 of the population dies, like, work is, you have to pay workers a lot more. But that's a huge problem for the ruling classes, right? Like, you don't want to do that. And so basically, through a complicated process, by the time of the Reformation, right, work is a commodity. So it has no value anymore. It's an empty thing. It's your labor power, 1 hour of capacity, an empty capacity, right? And you sell it. And think about how alienating that becomes, right? It's a factor of alienation that suddenly now, in order to survive, right? And then you have the enclosures, right? The basis of the capitalist system is chasing the farmers away from the land. You privatize the land. Feudalism is different. Like, if you own land in the feudal system, even if you're the lord, it's not your land, it's your lineage, and you have a duty to preserve it, right? And then you're the father, of course we can critique that, but you're the father of your serfs, so you have to protect and take care of your children. So in other words, it's a system of mutual obligation. You don't have absolute mastery over the land. Once you make it full personal property, now I can do with the land what I want. And I have people living on the land, but I can make more profit with sheep. I'm going to chase away the people and replace them with sheep. So this is called the enclosures, right? 16th century massive process in Europe. And so through these enclosures, now you have millions of people who can no longer live from the land. So they have to sell their labor power, right? So that's, of course, it's a very Marxist interpretation, but I think it's interesting. And why I think it's interesting, and how I come to today, because I think that what I call pre-production, and I think crypto is part of that, is a rebirth of meaningful labor. So what we build with free software and shared knowledge and share designs. So basically 93, right? Democratized the internet. So now millions of people, and now maybe 5 billion people, have now access and can create shared knowledge resources, right? And they're open ecosystems, and you can self-adhere your passionate skills, right? So this is why I'm so enthusiastic about this phenomena, because I think it brings back the notion of contributory labor, right? Labor as, I'm going to give my energy, my coding, my design skills, whatever it is that you bring to the table, to make something meaningful and make the world a better place, right? So it's the ikigai, right? The ikigai thing. And so just kind of so I think that free software brings back the capacity to self-organize and coordinate labor at a global scale. This is a radical transformation, that we can do this. We couldn't do this before. We could do it only at a small scale, like the village level, where you can solve your issues by talking to people that you know, but it couldn't compete with corporations, nation states, and so it remains something marginal in our modern societies. But once we have the power to self-organize meaningful labor translocally, right, we can scale. We can scale globally and mobilize millions of labor hours into common projects. And that's just not trivial, right? But we still had a big problem, which is we couldn't finance it, right? And so typically in open source is, if I improve an open source, for a commercial client, then I can make money. But if I do it for the project itself, it was not easy to make any money. So you have a problem, which is that the collective infrastructure was underfunded, and then IBM and all big companies come in, and you can see that every open source community is always sustained by one or several big corporations, and then get a huge amount of influence. And then the second step, that is, I think, where crypto comes in, is so now you have the capacity to finance this work, right? And so you have crowdfunding, which is interesting because now you don't have to negotiate only with banks and VCs. You can open up and distribute the financing, so become more independent of concentrated financing as before. And then you have tokens, and maybe you have to help me with this because I don't know how it works now. But so I tell you how it worked, when I was looking at it five years ago when you still had ICOs, because I thought, wow, this is amazing. So typically how it worked then, was you would write a white paper, and maybe you still do that, but please update me on how it's working now. So you write a white paper, right? And in the white paper you propose, this is what we're going to do, this is the potential value as we're going to do. So then you tokenize it, which is like a micro share, right? And you say, and 40% of that will go to the workers. I mean, I don't think there's any Marxist who has not done that at that level of success, right? So suddenly we have this kind of technique where we can coordinate meaningful labor, and we can finance meaningful labor, and we can reserve a huge part for labor, right? Okay, and then what we also do, I think, and that's interesting, is we consider capital as just another contribution. Right? We need capital, right? But instead of having this labor-commodity relationship, now we think, well, you're just another contribution. We understand that you need something in exchange for but you're not fully controlling our systems anymore, right? We try to align incentives so that these different stakeholder contributions become unified in a common goal. And we can do that translocally. Anyway, so I actually anticipated what I was going to say about this. I want to say one more story. I forgot. I come back to it. So please, I'm going back to my examples. We were in Europe, right? 11th century, 14th century. Now we're in Japan, 16th century. So what happened in 16th century Japan is that like periodically the Japanese, as any society does, any empire, any extractive system that's competing with others, they overuse their local resource. And that was wood, right? So China, if you look at China, it fell several times through the overuse of wood. And I don't know if you read that book, 1497, I'm not sure how accurate, 1473, right? The story about how the Chinese discovered Latin America. So this emperor sends out 5 big fleets, and people claim they can see signs of this everywhere. But when they came back, there had been a coup, and the new emperor burned all the ships and forbade the Chinese to go out, basically, right? And the reason he did that is because the Manchu region of China had been completely deforested because of this high level of building these ships, right? So that's typical of what happens in an empire is, the cycle, high growth, high use of resources, peak, declining, and then you have soil degradation and so that's what happened in Japan. So what you get is all these warlords fighting each other for scarce resources, but as a reaction, you had a conversion of the population to Pure Land Buddhism. And Pure Land Buddhism is, I don't know much about it, but you're an expert in this, but basically, right, you don't have to be fully enlightened. There's like an intermediary heaven, and if you say Nembutsu or whatever it's called, then you can get there. And so it's like a democratization of enlightenment. That's the way I see it. It's like Mahayana and Theravada, right? First, only really committed people can become enlightened, but then you say no. We actually, we need everybody to be saved, and Mahayana says, So that's the same reaction. And so they create communities of farmers. They're armed. They have weapons. That's not normal in a feudal society. The farmers cannot have weapons. And they have commons. So if you know a bit about Ostrom and the 8 rules of Ostrom, you can read these agreements in 16th century Japan. They're like pure commons agreements. So 1/3 of the country is commons. Of course, the samurai don't like that. So when the shogun wins, the first thing he does is disarming the farmers, and the second thing is nationalize the land of the church, right? But here's also what he does, and that's what makes it interesting. He protects the common lands. So in other words, he makes them into imperial commons. We can argue that the word commons is maybe not appropriate anymore. But anyway, so these lands cannot be used, right? He creates a social system that's also very interesting, where you have the samurai on the top, the farmers number 2, because they create the food, the crafts number 3, because they only change the food into something else, and the merchants at the bottom, right? So that's interesting. And then, for example, like in Versailles, if you're familiar with that, right? So he forces the nobles to go to Edo every 2 years. They cannot use wheels, so they have to hire a lot of people. So that's good for the economy. And for 2.5 centuries, Japan has a stable population with stable resource use. But the reason it's possible is because the imperial commons cannot be touched by anybody. So, again, it's always complicated in reality. I just want to show you again that if you think about the commons, you can illuminate history in a way that is different if you just think there's market and state, right? And by the way, Zen, why they invented Zen is because the samurai couldn't fight anymore, right? So you needed a new form of spirituality where you learn to be calm.
Samurai domestication.
It's like a domestication, right? In France, it was different. He used sex, basically, the courtesans, to calm down the warriors. but in Japan it's Zen. And again, I just want to illustrate the notion of the commons. Okay, I think so. The notion of pulsation of the commons is the following, and I go back to what I said last time, which is, so market and state systems, civilization systems are cyclic. They're extractive competitive systems, so they always overuse their own resource base. So they have a growth period, a peak, a decline period, and then a collapse and a chaotic transition. So basically, the role of the commons weakens during peak periods of civilization and strengthens in the declining periods of civilization, and becomes hegemonic in the transition period. Because when you don't have market and state, it's these mutualistic organizations become like the dominant feature. And why is that? Because it's all about the surplus, right? It's always about the surplus. Who gets to control the surplus? And so you have a managerial class and a productive, those that work and those that manage the work, right? Those that manage the work get the surplus, get to control the surplus. But often that becomes like luxury goods, right? In other words, so you no longer, so as the things become more corrupted over time, the rulers eat up more of the surplus without reinvesting it in the productive system, right? And that's when you get decadence, right? You rather buy a yacht than repairing the road. And, I don't think you can see that today. And so why is a mutualistic organization like a guild or monastery so efficient? Because all the surplus goes back in the productive capacity, right? In the replication of the system. And of course that also gets corrupted over time, but it works for usually 2 or 3 centuries, right? Very efficient healing and regenerative capacity. Okay, and so briefly I recap the transition dynamics the way I see it. So you have a system that loses its integrative capacity, has less surplus over time, different reasons. And so when you lose integrative capacity, so the institutions lose trust and the narrative no longer works, you get fragmentation of the narrative, right? When you have fragmentation of the narrative, you get polarization. If I'm alone, who is most like me? So here I'm going to say something very controversial, but I'll say it anyway. So if you're right wing today, you have more roots. You're bound to your locality. And so what you want is get back to the nation state, get back to my ethnicity, get back to my religion, right? So that's, if you're a nomadic, you're unrooted, what's happening then? And well, in my view, that's when you get, race and gender become dominant, because that's the only thing you have, right? It's more abstract. But everybody in the society looks for, like, who is with me, right? And that creates polarization. So within that process, you get exit. First, anticipatory exit. So people who see before others what's going wrong, and they think, I have to do this differently, right? So you go out of the system voluntarily, you take risks, you give up things, and you're a believer, right? Then you create seed forms, right? A lot of them will fail, but over time, some of these seed forms with a new logic, because you solve the problems of the old system with a new logic, and so you can start seeing the logic of these seed forms pointing towards something new. And so I guess here's where I'm different from most postmodern people when they say, oh, we can't know anything about the future. I disagree. I'm not saying you can know everything, but I say if you look at seed forms, you can see things, right? You have to pay attention to the seed forms and see what is common to all the things that work that are different. And I would argue today it's peer-to-peer in the commons. Like, everybody is doing something different that can scale up. They're introducing these peer-to-peer self-organized dynamics, and they have shared resources for their ecosystem. those are like two elements that I think are very important. So eventually the seed forms, you consolidate in subsystems, and then it becomes a question of new social alliances. For example, think about it in the Roman Empire, the system is declining, the Christians are organizing alternatives within it. When it collapses, they're still there, and so then the barbarians come in, the German tribes, and they start, they can't rule the country. They're from the woods, right? So they need the Christians, and that creates the basis of a new civilization. That alliance, particular alliance, right? So how can we apply this today? So I think what is typical of Web3, right? We have coordinated labor, we have coordinated finance, but what are we missing? And for me, it's real productive capacity. That's what we're missing, right? We are still an exit strategy, but we don't have direct access to productive resources. And for me, that is the next step. It's like, how can we, and so there's two things happening at the same time. So we have a trans-local evolution, people creating these new coordination mechanisms, that is what Web3 is doing. But we have lots of people who are grounded in the regions, and what are they doing? Community land trust, cooperative housing, shared transport. So millions of people are doing that, right? They're creating resilient, local productive systems, but they can't scale. They can't get capital. They're undercapitalized. And what if we could use Web3 for that, right? So not just being nomads amongst each other, but actually create this transmission belt from that exit capital to creating these regenerative, resilient, productive capacities in the physical world. So that's kind of my narrative, right? This is, I think, what we need to do. Of course, there's a lot more to say, but I think, and so I'll finish with this. So what I invite you to do is to look at history from the lens of the commons, which is what I just did here, but also from the point of view of coordination capacity, right? And this is where technology is really important as well, right? So why did the Roman Empire collapse to something much more primitive, which is the early feudal system where you only have agriculture, right? And the cities collapsed, the roads collapsed. Well, because they didn't have any technology to manage complexity. So when they no longer had the resources, they can only go down. But why did Europe, which had a very serious crisis in the 14th, 15th century, including civil wars which killed 1/3 of the population, why did we not collapse, but then created a nation state and conquered the world in a way, right? Became the planetary Western-dominated civilization. Because we had print, right? And we used print to reorganize the world and invent all kinds of things and had new weapons, right? So it's very important to have a technology as well. We cannot deny the role of technology. And so matter energy is bound in a certain way through technology, right? Hunter-gathering, arrows and bows, right? Then we have craft agrarian, mining is very important. We also get about mining because it's because we have mining that we can create armed states, right? Then we have print, we can create merchant and industry-based societies, right? Now we have the internet. And so what I think, the way we have to think about this is to create a meta container that then integrate the positive elements of states and markets and voluntary work, and what we invented is permissionless contributions. Create a meta container and then solve the problem of capitalism, which is externalities, right? So capitalist accounting is I'm making money, I'm growing my capital, but I cannot see what I'm doing to the world. I just cannot see it. A nation state is the same. I work for my population. I don't care about the planet. I cannot see what I'm doing to the planet, right? And so a lot of what we're doing in Web3, which is contributory accounting, so we can take into account non-commodity labor, and that's what public goods is doing. You have created a mechanism to fund collective infrastructure, self-infrastructuring, self-taxation without the state. That's kind of amazing in a way, right? Then you've created quadratic voting, quadratic funding, which is anti-oligarchic governance systems to mitigate the power of capital. Still there, still influential, but it's not an hegemonic in America. So you have a meta container which can use the dynamism of capital, but not be enslaved to it, right? And so, okay, so coordination capacity. So when we invent writing, we create craft agrarian civilization with a managerial class based on writing, right? Then we invent print and we create an industrial system. So it's a new way to bind matter and energy because we have this new technology. Then we create the internet, and that I think can go different ways. So I think if you think as industrial capitalism as a struggle between labor and capital for the surplus, right? Which we solved in a way through the welfare state model, which is of course declining. For a while it worked as a social contract, right? So I would say today, what's the struggle? Is between us commoners self-coordinating and those who own the platforms. So who is going to coordinate? I think that's a real issue. That's the class struggle of today. Who is going to coordinate these coordination mechanisms that we can build, right? And in a way, what they're doing is return. I mean, some people call it feudalism, but I think it's worse than feudalism. Because in feudalism, I'm the Lord, I owe you protection, right? Google and Facebook, they don't owe us anything. It's worse. They don't care about us at all, right? And so I think Web3 in that sense is a revolutionary force. Not in the sense that you want to burn everything down and replace it from zero, but in the sense that you're building seeds of a new system. The outcome is open, but I do think the commons is going to be very essential in thinking of, you know, how we get out of this. Thank you.
First idea that commons is actually a very long-lived and underrated part of history. Maybe even a majority of history, right? Histories in King's Chronicles, you see all the accounts of wars, and you think, wow, history is very violent.
Yeah.
It is, but because the peace are not so notable, people are too busy to write and having fun and living.
Yeah.
They don't write so much about it. So peacetime and maybe enabled by the commons essentially because of history. Yesterday, some of the CBAM group, we had a workshop around unempire infrastructures, which I think I told. And without prompting, two of the three topics were pirates and what we call Rise Now, which is basically a farmers collective, right? And a lot of the institutions you described, which of course have a historical basis, well, I would say imperfectly reimagined in those groups' ideas, right? How do you run a pirate ship? How do you survive? How do you ensure consensus? How do you you can't have too much deviance on a pirate ship because you can. So how do you enforce those things? And then the Rise Now, how do you actually ensure people gain more out of being together versus not? What are the processes for doing that? One takeaway is that for me is there's so much rhymes and cycles of history and these patterns that maybe we can learn from it. Is that farming was we started speaking about nation states and sovereignty, and we started one of the groups was about farmers. And I think it has to do with this real productive capacity agent, right? Web3 can be software. Right? At what point can Web3 become farm-free, or we can actually begin to handle supply chains and food systems and do alternatives around those things? Liberation from the current platform feudal overlords of social media and the platforms, right? Maybe that new organizing capacity of the internet. There's many hypotheses around and some prototypes, maybe that's one of the keys to actually be able to. So like yeah, many historical processes in play, but the context was.
I think you also want to say something. Sorry.
So you, on the topic of pirates, you mentioned that pirate ship is a guild of sorts, that is a kind of copy in that setup, and something like is Web3 DAO. What specifically makes it a commons versus just a private?
Well, maybe a word about pirates first, because pirates is the weapon of the poor, right? So you have to see the British Empire, and it's excluding a lot of people. It's repressing the poor very viciously for a time. And the pirates, they're basically people who flee the empire and create multiracial republics. It's very interesting to see it that way, right? But anyway, so what's the difference between a startup? Well, a startup is totally enclosed in the market vision, right? It's you're making a bet, then you get investors, and you're totally dependent on those investors. I did 2 startups. So I'm talking from experience, right? I'm not just saying this. And the thing is, like, you need the money, so you don't have much power to negotiate. And then what they do is they give you 3 years, and then they literally destroy you. A lot of startups actually are viable if you would let them like grow organically. But the business model of VCs is it's a betting model, right? They need 1 out of 100 to succeed, so then they don't bother with the 99%, and they literally destroy it. They withdraw the capital. You've signed NDA agreements and all kinds of stuff that you can't continue to work in the same area. I think it's quite a destructive model. So what's the difference is that, let's say Arduino, right, as an example. So you have common designs, and then you can create added value on top of that, right? And you're all codependent. You're still entrepreneur. You're still creating businesses. You're creating added value that is cars that you can sell in the market, but you have created a base that is growing over time that makes you strong as a coalition. Whereas a startup, if you don't make it to be a hegemon yourself, you don't make it at all. And so I would argue in a way that you could say that even in capitalist terms, commons are functional, because you can say, well, you can have a big company and you can have 50 or 500 researchers. But what if you have a coalition and they have 5,000 researchers all together? I think the commons model, even within a market vision, is has interest, right? But the difference is that how do you defend the commons, right? So you have an interdependency, so you have to be regenerative towards the commons as an entrepreneur and not extractive towards the commons. And a lot of the models that we have now, like the Google, the Ubers, the Airbnbs, they're very destructive towards the commons. They weaken it instead of strengthening it. So we have to look at, so how can we create strong core of commons and their contributory communities, strong entrepreneurial coalitions that strengthen and use that. And so what are the right relationships between the commons and those entrepreneurs? Then there was a model I think in open source free software is one model, and I think crypto is inventing slightly different models to do that.
I don't have an exact point. I love the discussion and really lovely to hear you talk. Thank you, Michel. I was struck by this point you mentioned around the deflation in at the earlier side of the story, 10th century, and how societies, because they were in this kind of deflationary economic system, were forced to grow. And I was like, oh, there's something in there interesting. And then I just thought, oh, actually, in a way, because of the global economics are falling apart now, debt is going up. In a way, we have our own. Yes, we have usury and we have big interest, but we saw more and more like a really rapidly growing amount of the population recognizes that basically crypto is the exit raft, the lifeboat, as currencies get more and more debased. And there's just like an interesting phenomenon there, as like in a way, our fiat money is becoming, you know, worth less and less, and then people are moving over. So it almost feels like we have this amazing opportunity in Web3 to harness this moment where people are waking up to this and they're investing, and in a way, like a lot of them are just seeking profit at the moment. But soon it might be survival, or more and more survival. You know, we know that in like certain countries of the world, Egypt, Turkey, like people have been saved by going into crypto, like whole families, communities, and I don't know. I just wondered if there's clearly like a really interesting conversation around monetary policy, and I know, like, you know, the Ethereum community has been talking more and more about the meme of ETH is money, ultrasound money. They're very like important parts of the discussion, but I think it goes over most people's heads, mine included. Like, it's a very complex topic, and I just always come back to forget the Yanis Varoufakis, his comment that, you know, around Bitcoin, as there's no such thing as apolitical money. And he had a very strong critique around society adopting Bitcoin as a monetary standard because it is deflationary. And there's a whole train of effects that come from that. So anyway, just I don't really have a point, but just, yeah, it's very interesting.
So can you just say just a few things about this? Yeah, I'm also skeptical about Bitcoin as, you know, like a total replacement. But I do think it's already playing a role as a reserve, a global reserve currency, right? I think just as what you said in the beginning is that a number of people are like arbitraging with Bitcoin, and I think that's a good thing that they can do that. But in the end, so I think Bitcoin remains a commodity currency, supply and demand driven. I think we need to think about it totally differently. And it's a bit complicated, but I think we need complementary currencies at the local level. These would be protective currencies. Like, for example, I was in Ecuador, right? If you're poor and you save money in a bank, that money is gone elsewhere. Yeah. Like, you're basically giving money to the rich. And so I think there is an interest, you know, locally, bi-regionally, to design currencies that have a certain power to mitigate flight and to keep the money reinvested in the local system. I think that's legitimate. So then we have crypto specifically. I think we can have domain-specific, thermodynamically informed currencies. I know that's a long word. What I mean is the problem with fiat money, I don't think the problem is that it's fiat. I think the problem with fiat money is that it doesn't represent anything real. It's a promise for the future, and now we have over-promised enormously because everybody's in debt. And so to tie money to real matter-energy dynamics, I think this is very important. And so, for example, Fishcoin, I don't know if it works, but I like the idea, which is, so you make as much Fishcoin as you can fish without endangering the reproduction of the fish. And the money knows it.
Fish surplus.
Right. Yeah, because that's the problem with fiat money. It doesn't know anything. It doesn't know. And so now we have programmable. Yeah.
Right?
So that's I think really good for cryptocurrency. I also think at the global layer, we probably can imagine, you know, some kind of basket of commodity and energy currency. So currencies that also tell you something about the global state of matter and energy flows, right? I think we need to think about bioregions, right? Because the state, I don't think the state will disappear, the nation state. You know, it's a political and cultural entity that has an history, and you can't just like undo that. A nation state is too removed from ecological realities. So we need bioregional reorganization. And let me just give you an example. This is a friend of mine in Seoul, Mark Whitaker, who, by the way, wrote a fantastic book about ecological political revolutions, showing how throughout history, you know, this dynamic, what I was talking about, is happening. And by the way, the example of the 16th century Japan is from his book. It describes in great details. Fantastic book. China, Europe, and Japan. And he describes these ecological revolutions in human history. But he has a thing, it's called commodity ecology platform. So we have 860 something bioregions. They're already very well defined. They exist, they're digitized. We have now systems that have like 130 plus commodities with their flows. That's been done, that's already done. I don't know if it's done perfectly, but it's there, right? Then he has not just the bioregion, but actually 5 levels of geographic hierarchy. And so his system can go to every Korean person, in theory, and they would know what he calls context-based sustainability. So in other words, you can make decisions that are thermodynamically informed. So I don't know too much about China, but I know 2 provinces in China, and I forgot their name, are already using biophysical accounting. And I know that today, if you want to make a career in the party, 10 years ago you had to grow GDP, and now you have to do something about the ecology as well, right? So it's already integrated. And so despite all the problems that you may have in China and the critique, so it's the first biophysical civilization in history, right? I was in Ecuador for 6 months. I was the only white person in a plane with 99% Chinese. And I was talking to somebody in the plane, and I said, yeah, we don't sign any contracts with money anymore. It's thermodynamic, matter-energy agreements, right? So you can, I'm not saying, it's the solution is there. I'm just saying you can see a shift in thinking that is really strategic, that money is just like, it's wind. It doesn't represent, so we need to go back to actually, like when we're in survival mode, and we have to fight for scarce resources, like you better know what is real, right? But I think that's what we are doing and should be doing more, is to build those tools. Now just one more example, I forgot the name, but Uber has this global system, I think it's called H3. They have a grid with hexagons, like 6, and so they can, search pricing, they calculate it within a hexagon, right? It's open source. I imagine what we can do with this now, right? We can really, really go cosmo-local, and you have the local information, the local context. At the same time, we have the global view in one system.
Just expanding on that, I think an underlying thing is that money and currencies have many jobs and can fulfill many functions. Bitcoin is largely a reaction to the Fed's monetary policy. And so it's in the analogy of like the pirates, it's a lifeboat. So it's where you go to exit from a system that you maybe have lost faith in. But it's a lifeboat, it's not the island. It's not where you can begin your new life. To do that, you actually need to like a whole different, almost like an ecology of different currencies or circulation within a local economy. Currencies that allow you to better index to ecological value, whether it's fish or forest or other things, right? And like in a way, like part of the Ethereum insight was that you want a programmable, almost like Turing complete chain that can actually support all these different kinds of monies to be developed. What should they be? So it's kind of almost like an ecology of money, that of different kind of monies and currencies. So very different kind of logics, right? Not all. In some cases, being deflationary is helpful. In other cases, actually, inflationary is to do the other things, right? So it's kind of almost like a pluriversalization of money instead of this one money that does everything.
Yeah, monetary biodiversity.
Find a diversity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
I think so too.
Is to ask the question to the students from LS and politics here, and then he say, well, the economy is related to the whole. Just imagine that the Earth is our home, and you don't know your home, and you're ruining it. Well, basically, for him, the economy should be understood as a house economy.
Yeah, and biophysical economy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because I used to work together with the local people, indigenous people in the villages, and then I witnessed so many projects that designed by the people who sit in office, they actually created so many problems for the locals. For example, they didn't have the idea of get sick. Some of the international NGO came there and started to promoting their awareness about AIDS. So kind of created this discrimination in the village. Before they don't have such thing. And after that, they started to have this kind of discrimination towards each other. And there are so many similar stories. But the problem is the whole Web3. Some of the projects related to the real world. But I guess for me, it's still the same question like Satish Kumar asked it.
Yeah.
So my question was how, and right, another thing is that Chinese government, so every farmers or growers they have, and so they have a unit which includes maybe dozens of families. They were doing a certain area, but if there's some disasters, they would sometimes they would move to, and they don't have such thing called tragedy of commons. People, every family taking care of the land very well. They have very strong sense of protecting the water source, protecting the grassland, and to care about the animals, because their life is highly strong related to the nature. But after 1980s, they started to have this conception about, then the tragedy of commons started. Everyone's protecting their own land. And because they don't allow us to move to other places, so that makes their land is even more precious. And the bad things in the care about others' land. And this is a very
Yeah, I think what you're describing is the enclosures. So it's global, and in a way, I know it sounds weird, but I think communism has been more effective in destroying the commons than even capitalism. It's more totalitarian in that sense. With a different philosophy. And in a way, I don't know if that's true, but that's the way I think about it. It's more like state capital versus private capital, right? But it carries kind of the same idea of how you develop consumers, workers, and people who decide where the capital goes. So it's just a variety of modernity, right? It's not, and so what you're describing are people who still lived with I don't know how they called it, but that's the commons, what you described, a natural, consciousness that they're interdependent of these shared resources and that everybody should care for them, right? You're born with it, but we lost it, so we need to recreate it. And that's the problem with Web3, like engineers, so, computer science, game theory, and also in economics, right? That's what most people in Web3 know, and it's not enough it's just not enough to, and so I would say we need to connect to real productive communities, because on our own we including me, I'm an intellectual. I can't farm. I'm not going to tell any farmer how they should farm. It'd be crazy to do that, right? But if you're interconnected with these types of communities, then you can co-learn. Because I do have something to teach them, and they have something to teach me, right? And so that's, I think, what Web3 should do is basically, orient yourself more to resilient, productive communities, and see how you can help them out. And I like Austin Wade Smith, who says, you have bioregional guilds, right? So those are the people that are really rooted, permaculture, whatever it is they're doing locally. And then you have the DAO guilds, right? And they're translocal experts in digital commoning, and they bring all the knowledge about the protocols, the corporations, and especially also innovation, right? Because this is something that people forget. Local people are not always very innovative. They tend to repeat, and so it's good to have people also that travel. And it's that mixture is the strongest. You have people that are know their land, know their forest, know how the water is working, bioregionally informed. And you have other people who've seen more things like, oh, that's how they do it there, this is how they do it there. So, and you need both. You need to find the right way to combine. as opposed to what's now is are we all hyper specialized and we don't know anything about the other, right?
To what you just said about this meaningful labor. So meaningful labor comes from those contributory labor, which at that time meaningful means more like mentally meaningful, right? But when we put that same word into like pure production, it means something more actually. It means not only like to have meaningful labor, financialize meaningful labor, and preserve meaningful labor. That thing has a little bit more. But I think it's a pitfall here, so it's highly related. Actually, meaningful is a word that doesn't. We can connect that to externality. Yeah. So we talk about externality a lot in this theory, right? But externality have a range because when you think about it, like to the far end is like the cosmos has its entropy, and you can't really do anything like have infinite externality. So I think what Scully just described is like something which seems like it has externality actually destroys something without we notice it. We think of things like we build something that is benefit for us and it has a little bit more than its externality and we are safe and comfortable with it. And I think maybe, yeah, what do you think about that?
Yeah. So when I think about cosmo-localism, right, that's basically, I think, so we should be fully local and fully cosmic at the same time, and fully differentialist and fully universalist at the same time. And we've never done that, right? We've just never done that. And we made many attempts, right? I mean, I think world religions are an attempt to create universal brotherhood, but only for people who believe the same thing, right? So, but even Marxism, is a universal brotherhood of working people. There's something beautiful in that idea, right? But it didn't really work either. But in the end, it's where we are. So this is a scheme I really like. So we had an immature biosphere, and then there was something called the Great Oxygenation Event, and that created Gaia, Earth systems, some kind of integrated biological system which protects itself. Like it has some capacity to, protect the whole atmosphere, in some way, right? So because of that created the technosphere, so human culture and its technology. But it's an immature technosphere which destroys the biosphere. And so now we're in this really narrow path of transition. And if we go through it, then we can live for a really long time in balance with our environment, right? But we've never done it. We've never created communities that didn't have enemies. And it's actually, and I don't know how to get out of this, right? So it seems in us that we need enemies to unite, right? And we know René Girard, and that's really worth knowing. So it's called the mimetic theory, right? So the thing is, we have needs, but what our wants are actually social. So I have that with my kids, like my two youngest children. My daughter was not interested in something, but when her brother was starting to play with it, then she wanted to play with it, right? We are all like that. So we look at everybody else, and so he calls that mimetic desire. We know what we know because we look at everybody else, right? And then we are always ranking ourselves. We're always looking at, am I below? Am I higher? It's like, okay. So what happens is that creates tension in society. That's his theory. And that needs to explode. The only way to do this is to find a scapegoat, right? So we have a joint enemy, a witch or a foreigner or whatever, right? And so now we're all united. We have an enemy, right? And so he says, this is maybe a weird theory, but I think there's a lot to it, that religion is a regulation of that, right? So now we decide to have rituals and sacrifice in a regular way, so that we don't have to do it in a wild way. In a way, civilization is a way to ritualize sacrifice, right? And then, this is even more controversial. It says that that the Christianity is like the first time that the religious figure says, "I sacrifice myself, so nobody else has to sacrifice." but it doesn't seem to work very well, though, right? But so this is really a huge problem for us, for humanity. Is like, how are we going to jump to planetary care, and not without having a common enemy?
Could it be an opportunity?
Yeah.
Here is like, okay, one way is to outsource this connection to nature. We let them save us, or we let them guide us. But I guess the challenge of the question that comes up is that there has to be enough critical mass within this technology group to see that this is even needed, to have this needed, and then to even move. I feel like that requires a very deep, almost, I mean, you mentioned the monks of the Christian monks and the, quote-unquote Asian monks, and the inward-looking versus the outward-looking. And like, if right now, we've been very imbalanced, my senses, material, I can measure it, I can know it. And so if we really do need to make this transcendence and this transition towards new ways of knowing, towards seeing the commons not as just a resource that has to be modified, and then like there has to be some sort of evolution, call it spiritual evolution, some sort of evolution within this society as well, that then creates that impetus. And so I guess that's where I feel sometimes that how is that?
Say something about it. So I don't know how to solve this, but I think learning is going to be crucial, right? So one of the problems that I have today, as an older person, I still grew up, in this kind of like social democratic paradise, where there was still a notion that the state was uplifting people, right? So like you look at public television 40, 50 years ago, it was pretty good. I was really uplifting people, like we were learning things, right? And then in the 80s, the market was going to solve everything, and now you make stuff and it makes people dumber, right? So you go, if you want to be popular, you have to go to the lowest common denominator, which is sex and violence. And so all our media have become means not of uplifting, but of pushing us down, right? And so, okay, I read a lot about After Rome, but you have to imagine this. So Rome had destroyed its farmers. Like, there were no farmers. The food came from Egypt, and they had slaves making oil and wine, right? So when they lost control of Egypt, they had no farmers. And these monks, that's what they did. They trained people, like in
Civilization Recovery Academy.
Yeah. And so I'm part of this group, with Daniel Schmachtenberger, Civilization Research Institute, and Zach Stein, he wrote a book, Education in a Time Between Worlds, right? And so the way he thinks about it is we are forming new Jedis. We have to recreate Jedis. Okay, I know it sounds a bit weird, but because we can't do it. We just don't have the right human beings, including myself, with the kind of skills. I mean, we